guys, Dr. Robert Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I wanted to talk today about insulin. It's something I've talked about before, but I wanted to talk particularly about insulin and appetite and how meal frequency and fructose fits into the regulatory control of insulin and how that can help with the control of appetite. There's a lot of information about insulin on the internet. There's a lot of books that have been written about insulin. It's a very important hormone in human physiology and all mammalian physiology. It's really the primary anabolic hormone. It's insulin's role, and the best known role for insulin is the storage of nutrients, and in particular it acts to lower blood glucose levels by pushing glucose into the cells. And that's really the role that insulin has classically been given, and it's really the first role that you learn. But insulin is a very complex hormone. It interacts with other hormones, and that is an oversimplification of how insulin really is used by the body. So I wanted to take it to the next step. I wanted to show how insulin is one of the primary regulators of appetite. And this makes perfect sense, because if somebody eats some carbohydrate, that carbohydrate goes into the gut. That carbohydrate then stimulates the release of insulin. And as that carbohydrate is broken down into glucose and passes into the blood, there needs to be a mechanism to lower the blood glucose levels and push that glucose into cells. And that's really what insulin does. It attaches to receptors on cells. Those receptors stimulate glucose transporters, and those glucose transporters allow the uptake of glucose. Now, if we're in a situation postprandially where we've got high levels of blood glucose because we've eaten carbohydrate, it makes sense that when insulin is released, it has to have a mechanism, a negative feedback mechanism, in order to be able to decrease appetite. And the reason for this is obvious, is because when you've eaten, your body doesn't want to overload your body with nutrients. It needs to take in nutrients. Obviously, it needs to maintain its blood glucose levels. It needs amino acids, it needs fatty acids, and all the other things it needs, but it doesn't want too much of them. So as insulin levels rise after you've eaten a meal due to the carbohydrate content, and also, sometimes toward some of the amino acids also stimulate insulin release, there is a mechanism whereby the insulin goes into the central nervous system. The central nervous system detects the levels of insulin and also the levels of blood glucose, and as they rise, appetite is actually decreased. There's a decrease in appetite in order not to overload the cells with nutrients, and that makes perfect sense. It's a perfect negative feedback loop that makes sure that you eat enough nutrients to be able to supply yourself with energy, but you don't eat too much. Now, how does this relate to meal frequency? Well, if we compare studies that have looked at subjects that eat a single large meal with those that eat multiple small meals, we notice some differences in the insulin response to those types of meal. When you consume a large meal, what happens is the peak insulin levels tend to be very high. In other words, it causes a very large insulin spike. But at the same time, that insulin spike is temporarily quite short, so that after the insulin levels have risen, that will cause an appetite decreasing effect. The insulin levels will tend to fall back to baseline and maybe even lower than baseline, and therefore therefore appetite would then be stimulated after a particular amount of time. So you eat the meal, your appetite decreases, and as your body lowers blood glucose levels and the insulin levels fall back down again, what tends to happen is obviously the insulin levels fall, and therefore your appetite comes back, and therefore after a certain amount of time you'll feel hungry again, and then you'll want to eat another meal. If we look at those people that actually consume the same amount of calories that would be in that meal, but they space that meal, let's say over 5 smaller meals, what actually happens is the peak insulin levels are much lower. The peak insulin levels never get to the same height, and that's because the carbohydrate at each individual intake is smaller, and therefore less insulin needs to be released. So instead of getting this large peak and then a large tailing off of the insulin, what we tend to find is that the insulin will rise more slowly, and then just as the insulin levels are coming down and the blood glucose levels are lowering, the next meal is eaten, and then that pushes the insulin levels up again. So temporarily, the increase in insulin above a particular threshold is actually for longer. And we know that insulin feeds back to the central nervous system to cause a decrease in appetite. So what we actually tend to find is that insulin levels don't rise as high when you eat more frequent meals, but the insulin levels stay high over a longer period of time. And what researchers have found is that this is a very effective way of reducing your appetite. Remember, these meals are the same amount of calories that's just split into 5. And if you split that meal into 5, what tends to happen is that when you're then given free access to food, so you take one group, you give them a large meal, you take another group, you give them 5 smaller meals, the same amount of calories, then you give them access to free amount of food, eat as much as you want. What happens is those people that have had the 5 small meals tend to eat less. And the reason for this is that, and there's a very interesting study that looked at this, the likely reason for this is when you have a look at the last meal of the 5 that are eaten by the 5 meal group, that last meal stimulates the release of insulin, so that at that time point the insulin levels are higher in the 5 meal group than they are in the single meal group. The single meal group's insulin levels have already dropped back down, and that 5 meal group's insulin levels are now higher than the single meal group. And that is very likely why, when you do these kinds of studies, the group that is consuming the 5 meals tends to eat less at that free food, ad libitum amount of food, they call it. And this is to do with maintaining your insulin levels. And there's many books that have been written, and there's a lot of information on the internet about maintaining your insulin levels within this kind of, a narrow threshold of not. What you don't want is you don't want to stimulate too much insulin release. Generally, if you take in a very large meal, you consume a large amount of carbohydrates, your body will produce large amounts of insulin. That will drive the carbohydrate into cells. If there's a large amount of energy there, much of the energy will go into fat cells. But what tends to happen is that you get a drop in insulin levels, you get a drop in blood glucose, and it's the drop in blood glucose you get from this drop in insulin that actually may stimulate appetite in those people that consume fewer meals. So there's a comparison of why, if appetite is important to you and you want to try and decrease your appetite, consuming the same amount of energy but in smaller meals throughout the day is a much better strategy, and it's very well evidenced in the literature, and anecdotally as well. People that have tried this, they seem to think that, they seem to say that, give feedback that this is actually a much better way of maintaining control over your appetite. So somebody that was trying to lose weight, was exercising, when you're exercising and you're conscious about your energy intake, quite often you feel hungry all the time. So if you're feeling, you've got that appetite and you want to try and suppress it somewhat, this is a very good strategy. Now I want to bring fructose into this as well, because there is a very interesting connection with fructose. Fructose is one of the only carbohydrates that doesn't cause the release of insulin. So when you consume glucose, the glucose goes into your blood, and the glucose causes the release of insulin from the pancreas, and the insulin levels rise. Fructose doesn't do that. Fructose is absorbed without the release of insulin, which is therefore very interesting, because fructose is an obesogenic compound. We know that fructose is able to cause insulin resistance. We know that fructose is able to cause weight gain, and insulin resistance is one of those mechanisms. But if fructose is not causing the release of insulin, it's also not causing this appetite inhibitory effect. So you can eat fructose and it won't have such a great effect on your appetite as if you eat something with glucose in it. And again, many studies have looked at this, comparing glucose with fructose. the insulin released from glucose is obviously much higher, and this may be why another one of the reasons that fructose is a very obesogenic compound. Remember, we find fructose in all of the types of foods that we associate with weight gain, particularly soft drinks, concentrated fruit drinks. These are actually very detrimental for your metabolism, not only because they cause insulin resistance, but also because there's no associated glucose release when you're consuming fructose. And it's really this insulin release that we need in order to be able to regulate appetite. Now, that's not to say insulin is the only compound that regulates appetite. It's one of many. Insulin has, for example, a role. It plays a role in the metabolism of leptin and how leptin is detected. Insulin resistance can lead to leptin resistance. So there are multiple interactions between various hormones that have an effect on appetite, and there are many short peptides and other short-lived hormones that are released by the gut that also go to the central nervous system to regulate appetite. But they all seem to be linked to insulin. Insulin seems to be this master controller for appetite. It's a very important hormone. It's one of the most it's one of the most probably the most anabolic hormone in the body. It causes huge amounts of energy to be passed into storage, and therefore it's very important to control insulin. And one of the problems you'll get is if you don't control your appetite, you eat a large meal, you get a large spike in insulin, a lot of the nutrients goes into your fat cells. That causes an increase in adiposity. But if you don't control your appetite and your blood sugar levels drop, you start to stimulate your appetite again, and that causes you to eat another large meal, and you start this cycle of overeating. So to get out of that cycle, eating smaller meals is a very good idea. And also, if you're interested in controlling your appetite and maintaining a connection between your appetite and your energy intake, avoiding fructose is also very important. Fructose is in fruit. Does fruit have the same effects? I've always said this: fruit should be eaten in moderation. There's nothing wrong with fruit. There are a lot of good properties, healthy properties from fruit, but you can get all of those healthy properties from vegetables. You don't have to eat fruit. You could have a high vegetable diet and get most of the phytonutrients that you would be able to get from fruit. So it's, people tend to look at issues in black and white. Fruit should be moderated. Fruit juice should be severely moderated. And you don't have to eat fruit. You can eat a high plant diet without eating fruit. You could just eat vegetables, and vegetables tend not to have the high amounts of sugars that you find in fruits, and most of the sugars that you find in fruits tend to be either fructose or sucrose, and therefore there is a high amount of fructose within fruits, and therefore they're not the best food in order to be able to, like I say, maintain this connection between appetite and your energy intake, which is really how you should be maintaining your body weight. When that connection disappears because you get insulin resistance, or because you're not controlling your insulin levels, which can be caused by having insulin resistance, that's when you start to overeat and you start to gain weight. And you've got to avoid that, or if you're in that situation already, you have to reverse that. Two very good ways to do that: small meals frequently and avoiding fructose. So I hope you found that information interesting. As always, eat well, stay healthy, and protect yourself. And I will see you soon for another video. Take care.